Well, I had some spontaneous experiences as a child, and then I basically wanted to learn how to do it for myself. So I went out and I read everything I could on the subject basically, and learned to induce it myself, through a lot of hard work and persistence. Really, it took me 6 months to induce my first intentional OBE, and when I say 6 months, that was 6 months every single night. I didn't miss a single night. So there was a lot of persistence and consistency, and I think that is often quite key in this kind of practice.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say, don't they, that doing it at night isn't the best because you end up falling asleep or whatever. I've never understood, because I usually think that during the day we're too busy doing stuff, most normal people, and then at night for me is the perfect time. But a lot of people say that's not the case. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think there's not a one size fits all. I think the way to think about it is not to sort of talk in those, the night is not right or the day is not right, or I think more a better way of looking at it is that people are different and that they work better at different times of day. I mean, I put a lot of emphasis on chronotypes, whether someone's more of a nighttime person, a daytime person, these kinds of things, and that will factor in to when is the best time to do the practice. So it's a lot more about almost becoming a scientist of your own self and learning to analyze what works best for you as an individual and what seems to have an impact on you. And I started off by doing that with myself, and then later on realized, okay, I can analyze different types of people and different approaches and ways to work with the out of body experience, and maybe that'll give insights into how to induce them. Lots of people have results with different techniques, and other people have no results with exactly the same techniques.
Yeah.
So there's a reason for that, and I think part of the reason for that is actually not really considering physical and psychological well-being or their own state of mind when they begin doing the technique. Often people go from watching the news or something in a very mundane state to then trying to do OBE practice and not really considering that they need to take themselves essentially into an altered state before they can go through that process. So it's well, I just think there's a lot of elements that are overlooked, and I think actually the bits that are overlooked are the bits that allow you to have the experience consistently. That's where I think most people go wrong, is that they focus on techniques. They're looking for the wonder pill that's gonna sort of get them there instantly, and there is no such thing. So it's sort of in a way they're sort of focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah, they're skipping
if
the
they focus
important.
more on, in essence, yeah.
Because that's something that I of course when you look at astral projection or out of body experiences online, you've got pages and pages on how to do it, how to have an OBE tonight, all that nonsense. And I think it's become a lot more trendy these days as opposed to an actual important practice that people should be doing. It's more of a do this and you'll be cool and you'll have a story to tell, so do it tonight. And I think people have missed, as you say, kind of the fact that it's not just a cool thing you can do. It's a potentially, or almost certainly, a life-altering experience that requires a lot of discipline.
I think discipline can be a tricky word, because discipline can actually be counterproductive with some of these practices, because discipline also often causes a stress reaction in people, and that can lead to tension and can lead to not being able to get into the right physiological, psychological state for the OBE to happen. So there's a lot of factors, but well, I think like with everything, there's always a mainstream and a very sort of popularist aspect to it, which is in nearly every field of life is going to be the more low quality kind of junky kind of aspect of the subject, and then there's always the people who are, you know, doing the work and not making the ridiculous claims. And
Yeah.
you know, like I can have a note OBE tonight if you watch this 5-minute YouTube video, you know, that kind of thing. But I think that's just the world in which we live. It's about looking for the work that has substance, you know, ignore all the sort of multi-dimensional new agey, you know, oh, you know, I do this and I do that sort of type stuff, and look for the people who, you know, are approaching things in a more scientific way, in a more objective way, and are more actually like cautious and humble about really dealing with the subject, you know, not claiming they understand everything. I think the more authoritarian someone is and the more certain they come across in how it all works, I think, you know, the more we should walk the other way, really.
Yeah, I think that it completely misses the point. If you claim that you understand it and you can do it every time and everything, I think you're missing the point of the whole purpose of it, which is to keep learning, isn't it, surely?
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm not making a sort of judgment on what the purpose is. I think lots of people have different reasons to do it and different purposes and all of that. But I think what's important is just to have the humility to understand that we haven't worked it all out, no matter who's claiming that they've worked it all out. I mean, when it comes down to it, when it comes down to the science, we haven't worked it out. We're a long way from working it out.
That's kind of an understatement, I'd say.
Yeah, and the people who claim to have worked it all out generally completely ignore the science. So that in that context, I think they're kind of almost harming the field rather than helping it.
And you can
that's kind of,
you can see the common conflict, can't you, between the kind of the two common polarities of that, which is mainstream hardcore materialistic science versus, say, orthodox religious people, both of who are certain that their view is correct and will fight tooth and nail, dismissing any evidence that supports the opposite. Because
well, I think it's quite irrational to believe you're right in any area, whether it's extremes of religion or extremes of materialism. I mean, I think that we should all really try to cultivate more of a understanding of we're human beings, and rationally it's very unlikely that we've worked everything out, you know, even in very basic terms. And we do all tend to lean towards listening to a particular group of individuals, and it's very easy to get lost in that and to forget that there's so much other information, and we just haven't got the time or the capacity to really understand all of that stuff. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind in any field, and not sort of talk in a way that, oh, I'm completely convinced by what's going on. And I think that actually leads to learning a lot more about the subject. I think by taking that kind of position with my work, I've started to discover a lot more things by doing that. I mean, early on I did take on which is essentially rehashed theosophy. I took on all the kind of etheric body, astral body, all that kind of stuff, silver cords and all of the rest of it. And the more I started to question that and say, well, okay, is that exactly what's going on? Is that all completely the case? The more I would find that there was vast areas of evidence that contradicted it. And if I kind of put all those beliefs aside and just actually said, okay, this is an out-body experience, this is what people are describing. So if I start from that point of view, from what people are actually describing and experiencing, and I mean more like ordinary people, not people with a particular religious viewpoint or a particular new age viewpoint, whatever. If you just take people who have had experiences but are not really invested in any particular point of view, you find more and more that their experiences are contradicting a lot of the esoteric viewpoints. So that essentially led me to start to question those ideas and to move away from thinking in those kinds of ways, and to start to look at what is actually happening in the experience. And okay, what assumptions am I making? What assumptions is the field making? For example, at the moment I'm looking at visual perception in out-of-body experiences. For a long time it was simply assumed that vision looks exactly the same as it does physically. No one really thought to look into that and to analyze that, even in the field of near-death experiences. So I started to look at that. Okay, is my vision always the same as physical? The answer is no. Is the vision of people who have near-death experiences always the same as the physical? And the answer is no. Are the things that people see, is there any consistency in those elements? And the answer is yes. So the more you start to look directly at the experiences in a lot of detail, you actually start to discover new things, which might actually lead to us having a greater understanding of what the experience is.
And I think the important thing with that is to be able to have the awareness of when your belief systems are kind of disrupting that raw data, and you're interpreting it in a certain way based on existing beliefs. And that's the difficult thing, being human.
Yeah, sure. I guess the thing is, now I wouldn't really say that I have a particular belief about out-of-body experiences. One of the good things, I guess I do in other areas of life, but one of the good things about out-of-body experiences is I don't really mind if there is an astral body. I would love to find evidence of it. And I don't really mind if it's sort of an extended consciousness of some form. I don't have a strong sort of preference either way on what is the case. It just seems to me that the evidence is leading more away from that sort of more classical viewpoint on what was taking place.
So from your experiences then, I'm assuming that your current understanding is that consciousness is kind of a separate thing and not dependent on matter.
Ooh. Well, to start with, I wouldn't claim to even know what consciousness is. I mean, we have to unpack that quite a lot. Dependent upon matter, depends how far you extend matter, really. I don't know if there is anything outside of matter, or whether it is all just some form of matter. For example, it could be non-locality within quantum mechanics. It could be this sort of idea of causation. There's lots of possibilities for how information at a distance seems to be coming into the human brain. Whether consciousness is separate from the brain in terms of ideas like in near-death studies, you get the idea of the brain is more like a filtering valve, is a common idea. But again, I'm with that kind of evidence, I'm not really convinced one way or the other. I tend to lean towards that it could be something along the lines of the brain is kind of like a computer, and there's a kind of network, something like the internet, which would be psychic information, if you like. And you're connecting to that information in some way. So that information exists both within the computer, within the system, and it also exists outside of it. It could even be like a duplicate rather than, a singular contained thing. But these are just ideas. I mean, I'm not wedded to whether it's a filter or whether it's a network.
That's right.
Both ideas are interesting to me. I don't discount either of them. But at this point, I think again we don't have enough information to really know, because we're still even trying to understand how consciousness works, what consciousness is. You have different frameworks of consciousness. You have like Daniel Dennett's idea, which is pretty much that consciousness is just it is almost like a point of gravity. It's kind of how he describes it. He sees it that there is no consciousness in the sense separate from the functioning of the brain, and that a lot of our idea of the self is essentially an illusion. So that in that context, the hard problem of consciousness, the inner experience, the qualia of experience, that would be very, very difficult to explain in a normal context. But in his context, it's almost like he can bypass that, because he's essentially saying that inner experience isn't real. In a sense, it's not really an inner experience, but somehow that seems problematic for me as well. So then there's ideas like the phi theory, which is this sort of idea that there's it's PHI, this idea that there's information essentially, or consciousness in some rudimentary form in nearly everything, which is a bit similar to panpsychism and ideas like that. So there's lots of different frameworks and ideas. And then the Or theory of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, they have this idea that there's entanglement within the microtubules, within the low-level structures of cells, which actually exist throughout the body, but he focuses on the context within the brain. So again, that would almost be like an extension of consciousness. So you would have the functioning of the brain, and then you would have that information, or that possibility is extended. The possibility of information, the possibility of awareness is extended beyond the brain via these low-level quantum effects. So
in simple terms, it's kind of a backup of consciousness in this entanglement. Yeah, I suppose if that's what I'm getting from it. So similar to how a computer works, you create information on your computer, whatever, you back it up to a cloud, that information's still available even when that computer's not around. Is that that's my understanding of Stuart Hameroff's?
Well, that would be more how I see it. I'm not sure that's how Roger Penrose would describe it. I think his viewpoint is more kind of simultaneous. He sees essentially that consciousness arises from that level, so consciousness exists fundamentally as a kind of quantum effect. I think that would be more how he would describe it. But yeah, again, it's an extremely complex concept, so without Roger Penrose here to highlight the subtleties of it, I wouldn't want to speak for him. No. But I get the impression that he, for example, he definitely doesn't believe that AI will become conscious because of some of these key elements within his theory, whereas I personally don't really see any major issue with that. But again, it all depends how we define consciousness. So it's a can of worms, really.
It is. Again, it all comes down to definitions, doesn't it? I mean, I know the main argument with consciousness at the moment is the standard. Is it separate from the brain, or is it an emergent property of it? That's the kind of the two understood polarities of it. There are everything in the grey area in between, as we're saying from that last segment there. But generally, those are the two, I think, or at least the two that are the most prolifically argued for. Yeah.
Well, I think within the main sort of science of consciousness, I don't think there's many people arguing that it's a separate thing from the brain. I think that's quite specific to sort of near-death studies and areas like that, where people are really arguing that. I personally find that quite a tricky idea to really justify.
Yeah.
I think it makes more sense to say that it arises from the brain, but it can extend beyond the brain.
So in that case,
Or
then,
that maybe,
yeah,
I was just going to say, or that maybe the fundamental principles of it are in place, and then it arises through the brain.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to anybody with some form of common sense that the brain is at least incredibly important in the process.
Yes.
Yeah. So in that case, then, my area of focus is the nature of death and life after death and experience after death. So what do you think then is, or what's your take on that kind of area from your experience up till now?
I think that there is probably some continuation of consciousness. Again, exactly what form that takes is very difficult to say. I think it's probably a combination of factors, because we have slightly sort of contradictory bodies of evidence. For example, if we take the research from the Windbridge Institute, you have the idea of medium communication under very, very strict, sometimes triple blind conditions. So very, very highly controlled studies, which gets very, very significant results for mediumship communication. So you have that. Then you have other areas like past life memories in children.
Ian Stevenson, things like
for example, even Ian Stevenson, and then it's still going on at the University of Virginia. There's also Erlander Haraldsson in Iceland, who worked with Ian Stevenson and continued some of his work, and I've met Erlander a few times and been involved with organising some of his talks, so I'm very familiar with his work as well. So if you put these different areas of work together, you put sort of past life memories, and then you put sort of survival communication, mediumship and things like that. In essence, there's something slightly contradictory going on there, because you have one structure that's saying that we have this continuation after death in a sort of afterlife realm, and then you have this other body of information that suggests that we come back. And so I think that if we take that objectively, well, that suggests that maybe multiple different things happen. And I think that we also get something along those lines if we even look at different types of near-death experience, and we look at different types of out-of-body experience. So I think as we start to sort of break the evidence down and to look at the evidence in more objective terms, you start to think, okay, well, what's going on there? Do we have multiple access points to the same information or the same pieces of consciousness? Do we have a kind of, like I mentioned, a sort of network of consciousness? And that's why I start to lean in that direction, because we have these things that seem contradictory. So in that sense, it suggests that maybe it's not a singular thing. Maybe there's copies of consciousness. Maybe we have multiple consciousnesses. Maybe it's not just a singular thing, which I know is not as romantic as to think that we continue in exactly the same form. But I think if we look at the evidence, it tends to suggest that maybe something like that's going on. Then we have experiences which seem to be more, I guess, otherworldly, which when I was working with Rupert Sheldrake, for example, he put across the idea that he sees the evidence for afterlife experience and for psychic experience after death, that maybe it's some kind of almost like a dream-like experience. I don't think he means dream in the literal sense, but he means in the sense that it's a sort of abstract, it's not it's not like your identity and yourself is as strongly defined as while you're functioning with a physical body and a brain, etc. So those kinds of possibilities are what I'm interested in at the moment.
That's right. I mean, you hear a lot of experiences, especially in near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, that in that kind of state, everything is very similar. I guess on at least the lower levels, it's very similar to physical life, but with a lot less limitation. So your mind has more control, kind of like in the lucid dream state. So I'm assuming that's what he means when he says it's dream-like.
No, I don't think that's what he means. I think he means. Actually, I don't. I find a lot of the stuff talked about as out-of-body experiences often is lucid dreams. I wouldn't consider them out-of-body experiences, but that's where it comes down to opinion and differences of opinion. But a lot of what it gets framed as an out-of-body experience, I read it and I think that's a lucid dream. It's not an out-of-body.
I see a few of them as well. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of confusion, and I think going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I think that's a lot to do with the advent of the internet and a lot of sort of junk information on YouTube and all that kind of thing. So I think there is a lot of confusion, and then there is just differences of opinion. I think even within authors on the topic, I think there's a lot of differences of opinion. There's all this higher level. I mean, I find it interesting that the higher levels supposedly become more abstract and essentially useless, and the lower levels are when you can actually observe things and see reality as it objectively is, but that's somehow lower level. Again, I think this is going back to old-fashioned sort of esoteric ideas. I think in my experience, the more abstract, dreamy stuff was when I was a beginner. The stuff that I really value is when I can do things objectively, and I can perceive reality objectively as it is, and that's a hell of a lot harder than experiencing things in a very sort of abstract, sort of dreamy-like way. But we've sort of got this inversion that's happened with this hierarchy, and I don't think any of this is really a hierarchy. It just comes down to what's actually useful for us in terms of gaining understanding and exploring our own reality and whatever. And if it's so abstract and we can't really tell the difference between it and a dream, then I think that I find it very hard to know how we can really put any weight or how we can really take that very seriously. And but again, that's just my opinion.